Okay, letting everybody in now. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. We're just waiting a few more seconds for the last couple of people to join us from the waiting room. Lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to this evening's speakers for this discussion of cruelty or humanity, challenges, opportunities, and responsibilities, I would just first like to quickly reiterate some of the information that was mentioned to you in the email that you received with your link to join tonight's event. So first of all, you have all automatically been placed on mute, and you'll remain so throughout the evening until the end of the event, when I change the settings and allow you to take yourselves off mute so that you can join me in thanking Stuart and Judith for tonight's discussion. This doesn't mean that we won't be having a Q&A session, however, it just means that it's going to look a tiny bit different to what you might be familiar with. So we take questions via the chat box and they come directly through to myself. If you can't see the chat box, then it should be to the lower left of your screen, but don't worry if you can't find it. It will be popping up any minute now because I will be posting the link for you to purchase your copies of Cruelty or Humanity. I would like to also mention that we have a special promotion for event attendees on at Avid Reader at the moment. And that promotion is that if you use the code EVENT, E-V-E-N-T, at checkout when you make a purchase on our online store, then you'll receive 10% off. So as I said, I'll be sharing the link to purchase your copies of Cruelty or Humanity in that chat box shortly, and I recommend getting in early so that you can make the most of that promotion while we still have it. And so that's enough from me. It is now my pleasure to introduce Stuart Rees. Stuart is Professor Emeritus at the University of Sydney, founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation, recipient of the Jerusalem Peace Prize, and is regarded as one of the most humane voices of our generation. A human rights activist in several countries, Stuart has taught at major universities in the UK and the US and was Professor of Social Work and Social Policy at the University of Sydney. His books on social justice include this new work, Cruelty or Humanity, the novel A Lover's Country, and poetry anthologies Tell Me the Truth About War and A Will to Live. In conversation with Stuart tonight, we have Judith White. Judith is the author of the book Culture Heist, Art versus Money. She has worked as a book editor, journalist, and for 10 years as executive director of the Art Gallery Society of New South Wales. She lives at Tweed Heads on the New South Wales border. And so, Stuart and Judith, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Emma Kate. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the land of the great Bundjalung Nation, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to their traditional owners. It's a great pleasure to be with all tonight's avid readers, and a distinct privilege to be in conversation with Professor Stuart Rees, who is, as Emma Kate said, one of the great humanitarians of our times. He became known to many of us in Australia and internationally as the founder of the Sydney Peace Prize. Now, Stuart, in your new book, you document the cruelty perpetrated by governments throughout the world, and it seems that increasingly for certain governments, cruelty has become a matter of deliberate policy towards the most vulnerable in society, including refugees, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and the unemployed. Is it this tendency that prompted you to write the book now as a matter of urgency?
Yes, I mean, well, two responses to your question, Judith. First of all, I noticed that in the index of books about policy for the past 20 years, the word cruelty does not appear. In other words, states deny that that's what they do. And my second reaction, or the second reason for having a go at this book, was that I became increasingly appalled at various incidents of cruelty that was so degrading that I wondered why it shouldn't be exposed, why it shouldn't be discussed, and why governments should not be held accountable. I mean, there was a particular incident in the government of Saudi Arabia when a blogger who wanted slightly more openness and democracy in that theocracy was sentenced to 1,000 lashes and 10 years in prison for merely raising questions about free speech. It was that sort of incident that made me think, I have had enough.
Right. Now, you analyse in great detail how cruelty persists and how it's covered up, and how people become desensitised to it, how what you call the banality of evil comes to be accepted. Now, against this, which greatly enlivens the book for the readers, you counterpose the truths expressed in poetry. That's a highly original aspect of the book, and it's one that gives us hope. And Richard Falk, the professor of international law at Princeton and California, writes about this in his foreword. Could you just tell us how you came to connect the poetry and the politics, and why it should matter to all of us?
Well, I mean, several reasons. First of all, just to list the cruelty is so macabre and so off-putting, most readers would think it's entirely pessimistic. So I needed something to dilute the effect of the cruelty. And poetry, in a way, I mean, I've always been fascinated with poetry as being multi-dimensional, as exposing features of human conduct that you cannot always find in prose. And then if you read a couple of lines from a romantic like William Wordsworth, when he observed the cruelty involved at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in a very long poem called Humanity, he said, "What a fair world were ours for verse to paint, if power could live at ease with self-restraint." And you can almost hear in the rhythm and the music of those just those two lines why that would dilute the story of cruelty, and would give kind of intervals on every other page, which makes it easy to read.
Now, we'll come back to poetry later, but we have to look at the dark side of all this. And of course, no government, particularly a supposedly democratic government, wishes to be seen as cruel. And this means suppressing information in all kinds of ways. If you take war crimes, the first casualty of war we know is truth. Philip Knightley, the late Australian journalist, wrote a whole book about this. And yet today it seems harder than ever for reporting of war crimes to go unpunished. And the most egregious case surely concerns Julian Assange, who's been subjected to such cruelty in the UK that many doctors and lawyers have termed this torture. And that's for exposing war crimes in the Middle East. And of course, he's threatened with worse if he is extradited to the United States. Now, you're one of the people who has spoken up about this, but the Australian government has given him no support whatsoever. How do we explain this, and what can be done?
Well, several reasons. I mean, one is courage. Courage is an unusual quality in public life, and not too many politicians in Canberra and elsewhere show it. There are some brilliant exceptions in the case of the treatment of Julian Assange. Andrew Wilkie is one such reassuring exception. In the case of Assange, for some reason or other, the Australian government stays almost entirely deferential to whatever Washington tells them it wants to do. So the idea that we are an independent state when it comes to this sort of thing, to this sort of issue, is false. So you get Foreign Minister Maurice Payne giving these absurd, shallow assurances that Julian is given every possible consular assistance. It means nothing. But there's a long practice that you've almost hinted at in your question of deceit and denial to cover up the appalling conduct of states, democracies, dictatorships, theocracies. So that the PR, and this happened long before Trump and co invented what we now know as alternative facts. And you're absolutely correct to say that the cruelty to Julian Assange for telling the truth about murder and mayhem by US forces in Afghanistan and Iraq is a test of history. If he is extradited, if he is, I mean, he shouldn't be in prison anyway. I mean, there's no evidence of what he's done wrong. I spent enough time of my life in the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, to know how much you would usually get for skipping bail. They're desperate. The states, the United States, UK, and Australia, desperate to make an example of somebody who has told the truth.
Now, of course, the court proceedings about his extradition are now getting some coverage in the Australian media, but the genuine support for him, which exists in certain sections of society, gets very little coverage. For example, in February, I attended a rally in Martin Place in Sydney, an excellent rally, very well attended, of which you spoke, John Pilger, Quentin Dempster, Mary Kostakidis, a number of others. Spoke very powerfully about his case, and yet this was hardly reported in media. How is it that when he has the formal support of the Journalists' Union, so little of his real case gets reported?
Well, I'm afraid the so-called mainstream media have complied with the establishment, have complied with governments for years. And since 9/11, under increasing secrecy and anti-terrorist laws, they've become even more fearful. Mind you, the guts has been torn out of a lot of good journalism. But yeah, I recently spoke outside the Central Criminal Court in Sydney. There was a good rally. There was no coverage by the mainstream media at all. They studiously ignore that. I mean, when the Labour MP Shaukat Mosslemain was raided, his home was raided by the AFP. The News Corporation media got very excited and covered it. But when it comes to the issue of his dignified return to Parliament yesterday, they're no longer interested. So that raises questions about whether social media is an alternative to the mainstream, and I'm not sure about that.
Mm. Of course, another case in which there is a lot of media silence, and you do say that for media to remain silent is to participate in cruelty. You say that in the book. Another case is that of the Palestinian people, and this is a major issue internationally, whether it's the deprivation of land and water, killings of civilians on the Gaza border, or the mass incarceration and beating of Palestinian children. Very little of this gets into the media. Now, there are a few brave souls in Australia who remain undaunted. They include, for example, Bishop George Browning, wonderful man, Ali Kazak, the former Palestinian representative to Australia, who sends news out almost daily. And yourself, you've never stopped speaking out. And yet, why is the world so silent about the crimes against the Palestinian people?
This is a very good question, because the treatment of the Palestinian people is a test case for whether we believe in human rights, whether we believe in non-violence, whether we believe in the ideals of a common humanity. First of all, one reason for people not speaking out is that often they don't know. I talk to people still, and they don't really know. They think the Israelis were the people who made the desert bloom, and the Palestinians, or certainly people from Gaza, are largely terrorists. So that those false claims have got to. We have to talk more about the true history of that part of the world. We're dealing with the most brutal and the longest military occupation of another people's land since World War II. There are other reasons for not talking about it. One is I find it very difficult to distinguish between the government of Israel and the government of the United States. It looks the same thing to me. Another reason is this charge of anti-Semitism used to stifle any criticism of the behavior, the appalling behavior of the government of Israel. Now, anti-Semitism is like any other prejudice. It should be not tolerated and outlawed, but neither should we tolerate homophobia or Islamophobia. And I will not put up with being told that I cannot criticize the appalling abuses of human rights committed by the Israeli government. That doesn't mean to say I have anything certain against the Israeli people. So we need to demystify what these claims about anti-Semitism are. And it's been used for a very long time, even in this country, to stifle discussion about the Palestinian question. Do you want me to go on for another hour on that topic?
Oh, I think Judith actually just dropped out there.
Yeah.
We might just wait for her to come back, but you can, Stuart, you can continue if you have more to say on the topic while we wait for her to come back.
Only that I'll repeat that it's a test case. Everybody should know about the human rights of the Palestinian people. It's written into the United Nations Charter that every people have a right to self-determination. And for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is perhaps the biggest social justice movement around the world. But it gets treated as though we're told that the aim of BDS is to abolish the state of Israel, which is manifestly untrue. But the News Corporation likes to push that story, aided and abetted, of course, by Zionist groups around the world. Are we still losing Judith?
Yeah, we're still waiting for Judith to come back in. Sorry about this, everybody. Okay, it happens rarely, but sometimes we do lose people's connections. So we'll bring Judith back as soon as we can. I'm going to send her a message now.
Does that mean there's no electricity in northern New South Wales?
I'm not sure what it means, unfortunately. Let's see when she, let's see if we can bring her back. Is there, Stuart, in the meantime, is there another point that you would like to talk upon while Judith isn't here, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I think the major issue that everybody listening and hopefully everybody reading the book could benefit from understanding, if that doesn't sound too patronizing, is to look at the way cruelty is justified. I could not find any evidence that cruelty is dished out to people who are regarded as equal. It's the people on the receiving end of cruelty are people identified as unworthy. They're people often regarded as not really human. I've watched the way the Myanmar military have been slaughtering the Rohingya people, driving them from their homes. 1 million of them finish up on a treeless hillside somewhere in Bangladesh. But they're not really regarded as human by the Myanmar government, and which seems to entitle that government to shoot, to kill, to rape, and I have to tell you, even to throw small children into bonfires. because they don't regard them as human. They're not you're not allowed even to use the word Rohingya in Myanmar. But there's a long history of the Palestinians not really regarded as being human. In fact, not even existing, because and that relates very directly to the history of Australia, 1788, 1948. 1788 was an empty continent, so the British could take it.
I was just going to come back. And my apologies, my connection just completely dropped out there for a few minutes.
As long as it's not your heart pacemaker.
Thanks, Stuart. No, I'm glad you brought in the business of the invasion of Australia, because in the book you give very good historical context to cruelty in the modern world by detailing the crimes of past empires and of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And you don't spare such much mythologized figures as Winston Churchill, who deliberately let famine kill millions of people in India. He's on record as saying that he hated Indians, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion, unquote. Unbelievable, isn't it? But my question was, isn't the invasion of Australia and the treatment of its indigenous peoples a part of this colonial history that has yet to be fully acknowledged here?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the lives of indigenous people around the world, they've all been subject to slaughter and to genocide. And if I have to concede something about all my years in a privileged job at the University of Sydney, I think certainly when I first came to Australia, I knew far too little about the indigenous people, the First Nation people of Australia. And I don't think our children were told much about it in high school. And it's only recently, I think, with the apology to Kevin Rudd's credit, even the walk over Sydney Harbour Bridge to protest our ignorance. I mean, one of the key features of states' policies is to maintain the public in a state of ignorance. So most people were totally ignorant of what had happened to the indigenous people of Australia, even though it gives us an amazing momentum of a civil people whom we need to imitate. And I'll just explain quickly or briefly what I mean by that. All the years I spent on the Reconciliation Commission, I learned that indigenous people in different parts of Australia seldom made a distinction between their own health and the health of the land. They were one and the same. And if that doesn't give us a lesson about global warming and preserving a precious planet, I'm not sure what does. And yet, when the Makarrata, the message from Uluru came, an enormously important, inclusive, peacemaking message by the indigenous people of Australia. The Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull at that time, dismissed it almost overnight. So listening to the indigenous people, taking them seriously is the challenge that we have to meet tomorrow.
That denial of the statement from the heart was, I think, one of the great moments of cruelty. Now, of course, historians and First Nations people themselves, their writers, their artists, have given us an enormous amount of material, have really told the stories of dispossession and of the great civilization that was here before. If you take the work, for example, of Bruce Pascoe, and historians like Henry Reynolds, and others who I heard speak with you in Mullumbimby about this, have documented so thoroughly, and the stories are still coming out all the time, and yet we have a government which seems to think that the arrival of Captain Cook should be celebrated and new statues should be erected. What can be done to break down this wall of opposition from government?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I think that there have to be conversations about this in every context. It's a bit like what I'm saying about the redefinition of human rights. It's not the preserve of, we can't wait for lawyers to make a judgment. The discussion about human rights, in this case, the human rights of indigenous people, but of all vulnerable people, of all people, occurs every day of the week, almost every hour, in the home, on the streets, in educational institutions, in workplaces, and not just in the rarefied atmosphere of the sort of peace negotiations that I've been involved in. And the other thing to be said is that if you learn more and more about Indigenous history and read Indigenous poetry, for example, it will make your life more interesting. And that's why I often say to my colleagues and to students, I want you to be more promiscuous. And even the most sleepy student wakes up if you say that, then you have to explain what you mean by that. By that I mean that you have to trespass across every discipline boundary, and you have to derive inspiration from any source. And one of the sources for me was my close and long friendship with Senator Patrick Dodson, for example.
Now, as someone who spent all your working life in universities, teaching in universities, how do you feel about the current assault on the humanities, the defunding of courses, the fact that it's going to cost 113% more to study the humanities, which encompasses all the areas that you've been talking about, the arts, history, law, social science? Isn't this a terrible impoverishment of our society that we're facing?
Sure, yeah. You and I need to have a long drink about this, Judith. It's a terrible form of anti-intellectualism. It says, we don't really want you to think. I mean, the subject areas which students are to be charged a lot more money for are those which are encouraging people to learn how to think, to read, to analyze, to evaluate. Without those skills and qualities, then you don't advance very much. And it's incredibly sad. It's incredibly disappointing. It's all part of this notion that students, like patients in the hospital, are just a commodity. The students are being treated as no different from second-hand cars in a car yard. They have to. I mean, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a different period of history, when the values were different. It wasn't that the economics were different, the values were different. You were expected to go to have primary, secondary, and tertiary education by as an entitlement as a citizen, not something to be paid for. The idea that having students who would only be at university for 1 or 2 days, have to spend the weekend stacking shelves in Woolies or Coles, was completely foreign to me. But to come back to the question, look, it's an appalling statement about the values of this government and country that we think imposing those charges on students who want to read the social science and the humanities should be a feature of government.
Now, when we think about the relationship between the individual and the broader society, you do say in the book that there's a relationship between state-sanctioned cruelty, be it in wars or in the treatment of certain groups of individuals, indigenous people, refugees, and so on. So a relationship between state-sanctioned cruelty and individual cruelty, be it domestic abuse or gun violence, for example. And of course, it's a complex relationship, but one image that always comes to mind for me is from that film a few years ago by Michael Moore, Bowling for Columbine, where you could see the huge Lockheed missiles from the local factory coming right through the area where that terrible school massacre took place. Now, in what ways do you think that connection between state cruelty and individual cruelty operates?
Yeah, well, it's what I call the thin end of the wedge argument. If you tolerate the slightest cruelty and pretend, well, it was pretty if you can have such a thing as a modest cruelty, that has a ripple effect elsewhere. So, for example, the Sydney shop jock, Alan Jones, gets away with saying that the Prime Minister's, Julia Gillard's father, died of shame. Prior to that, for weeks, he'd been saying that she should be taken out in a chaff bag and drowned. Now, if people said to me, well, you shouldn't really put that in the book, and I said, well, no, it's the thin end of the wedge argument, because if you tolerate that, then if the personal is the political, the next thing you know is that other forms of violence, because that's an expression of violence, are tolerated. If we tolerate domestic violence, then there's a direct link between that, in my view, and the refusal of the Australian government to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I mean, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is the second biggest threat we face at the moment, alongside the damage to the planet. So, yeah, the personal is the political is the link to make.
A related question, in a way. You're a great advocate for peace, but do you think, given this terrible history of state cruelty, there's a distinction to be made between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed? Are there circumstances in which it's legitimate for people to, for example, in the fight against apartheid, that Nelson Mandela actually took up arms against apartheid? And isn't there a qualitative difference between the brutality of the policeman kneeling on George Floyd's neck and the actions of a minority of the many millions who protested, who resort to looting and arson? Do we make a difference between the two?
I think you have to make some differences, but there's a common denominator there, which is the fascination with violence as a way to solve problems. I mean, in a sense, we're talking about two different languages. One is because the policeman who put his knee on George Floyd's neck was expressing a particular language to solve a problem. The fact that he's got guns and batons and mates who stood by and did nothing is also part of that language. But so is the use of violence in any context. That's why I think I'm only slightly interested in peace. I'm 100 times more interested in peace with justice, because that raises the questions about other ways of living, other ways of thinking, other ways of envisioning what the future might look like. And it's almost like a composition. And in a way, Beethoven, in his famous the Ninth Symphony, the Peace Symphony, tried to explain, but through music, how to do that.
And the Ode to Joy has become an anthem for peoples all over the world who want justice.
Sure. I mean, the German poet who wrote the Ode to Joy said he wanted it to be a kiss for the whole earth. Now, if we want to talk about the environmental policy, sometimes described here as a new energy policy, what about a kiss for the whole earth? Because there's not going to be much of it left if we continue in the violent way we've treated the planet Earth for centuries.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, now this brings us to how, through changes in policy, we can move towards that better way of living that you're talking about, Stuart. And of course, both pandemics and climate change pose existential threats for all of us, but particularly for the most vulnerable. But there are problems about how we look at this. As you say, in the 1980s, the UN agreed a convention against torture and other cruel and degrading treatment, but it's had very little effect on many governments. And you also say that outrage is never sufficient. We see a lot of outrage on social media, but how effective is it in actually changing behaviors of government? But when people take to the streets, as they've done in their millions worldwide against police brutality since the killing of George Floyd, that does have an impact. What do you believe is the way forward for citizens like us? How can we contribute to making a real change in policy?
Yeah. Or in a way, we have to go back to the design of the United Nations. It was meant to be never again the Holocaust, never again the carnage of world wars. And in the wake of that carnage and those wars, we set up a rule-based order. Various aspects of international law, in particular the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention about the rules of conduct in war. But slowly, under the growth of right-wing authoritarianism and populism and racism, the international law has been regarded as of little consequence. I mean, even in a country like Australia that says it's human rights abiding and that it believes in mateship, we only observe human rights when it suits us. We spend $5 billion for 4 years sticking 1,500 asylum seekers on remote Pacific islands, and still claim that we are champions of human rights. We have to stop deceiving ourselves. We have to have the, if you like, the joy in fellowship. We have to abolish what Tawney and Galbraith called private affluence and public squalor. In other words, a major issue of injustice, a major issue of violence is the continuation of massive social and economic inequalities. And I mean, Australia tries to pretend that we're an egalitarian society when there are massive inequalities. But let's just talk about the inequalities between the relatively affluent West and some of the terribly poor parts of the world where I've worked and visited. So that means a different language, a different agenda about social justice. Because apart from it being just, it makes life more interesting.
Stuart, throughout this conversation, the issue of media has come up because there are great advocates like yourself. There are wonderful voices for Indigenous people, for refugees, that aren't getting an airing in the mainstream media. And we have a particular problem in Australia in the monopolisation of media. And if you take Queensland, this is a Brisbane-based event after all, you can go right up the east coast of Queensland and you can't buy a paper that isn't owned by Rupert Murdoch. And he, of course, his papers are deeply involved in the kind of stigmatizing of the vulnerable that you talk about in your book, in the stigmatizing of people who stand up for justice. And so don't we also have to address this as a serious matter of policy?
Yeah. It's a hugely serious matter because, I mean, when I go to Queensland, the only daily paper available is the Courier Mail. It's full of derision and racism and authoritarianism. It's a bit like saying that Sydney people will only get their ideas about life from the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Well, no, we have to watch. I think Kevin Rudd's current petition about the poisonous effect of news corporation around the world. It's not just in Australia, it's in Britain, it is in right across the United States. I mean, the people of the United States are brainwashed into thinking that they are exceptional and there is no other way of living. This is a country that thinks that to solve a problem, you buy a gun and shoot whomever you like, which has almost more people incarcerated than any other part of the world, including China. And yet it's lauded by news corporation. So we need a diverse media. We need conversation in every respect. I mean, there's so many. All the time I spent in courts of law, lots of offenders only had a conversation with anybody when they clashed with the law. That was the only point at which they were taken seriously. So we have to have a conversation about the future because it's urgent for our children's generation, for our grandchildren's generation. The issue of the two issues I mentioned, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons, and the condition of planet Earth, those are massively urgent issues about which we need immediate conversations.
Stuart, I would happily continue this conversation for a lot longer, but we have to allow some time for questions. Could I just say before we move on to that, and for other people who haven't yet read the book, one of the effects of reading it is that I now find in my general reading poems with meaning just jumping out at me, whether it's Shelley or Hugh MacDiarmid or Judith White or Ujuru Nunakal. And so I wondered if we could end this part of the event before we hand over to questions by asking you to read one of your favorite poems from the book.
Well, I'll try and remember, because if I start to read, I'll be fumbling for a book. But if you think of, this takes us back to the wisdom of Australian Indigenous people. Ujuru Nunakal wrote a poem, a wonderful Australian Aboriginal poet, wrote a poem 70 years ago, which in a way is about the pandemic crisis, about the global warming crisis, and about the need for an interdependence of peoples. She said, "I'm for humankind, not color tribes. I'm international, never mind tribes. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race." Now, that's, and she often wrote in association with the other poet you've mentioned, Judith White. They were good mates. One was a white Australian who was a great champion, the first great champion of the preservation, protection of the Great Barrier Reef, Judith White, and who talked about the passion for justice, the passion for life, the passion for love. Why can't we have love and kindness as the key element in the crafting of policies? She wrote a book, Judith White, I'll give you 2 lines of the last poem, then I'll stop. But you know, everybody watching knows something about the flame tree, that scarlet tree which comes out in this country in the summertime. And Judith White wrote, "How to live, I said, as the flame tree lives, to know what the flame tree knows, to be as passionate, to be as prodigal of my life as that wild tree, and to wear my passion so." So again, it's another piece of inspiration.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Stuart. And now back to Emma Kate for questions.
Lovely, thank you, Judith, and thank you, Stuart. We do have several questions coming through, so I'll jump straight in. The first is from Sheena, and it's got a couple of parts to it, so I'll read through it. People with disabilities have historically suffered incredible cruelty and neglect. The case of Adelaide woman Anne-Marie Smith, who was neglected to death recently, is a case in point. It takes cases like this before we have investigations and royal commissions. And Sheena asks, do royal commissions historically achieve any reduction in cruelty? What is needed to bring about real awareness of what is happening and positive change?
Well, the people who are friends of professionals working with citizens who live with a disability have to be generous. You have to put yourself out on behalf of others who are more vulnerable than you are. Even if you're, particularly if you're employed as a professional like a care worker or a social worker, my experience is you have to be generous. You have to go the extra mile. You have to. You can't do a job like that, a responsibility like that, in a routine manner. Otherwise, we might as well employ robots. So the kind of compassion and expressions of love and kindness, the kind of qualities, frankly, that Jacinda Ardern has displayed as the leader of New Zealand. Why those are the qualities that have to be expressed towards vulnerable people, such as those who live with a disability, every day of the week.
Thank you. And did you want to, sorry, there was the other part about royal commissions historically achieving any reduction in cruelty.
Well,
they do.
Look, they set a standard, but it depends on how the recommendations are ever implemented. I can remember the details of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. It looks as though it hasn't had much effect at all. It totally depends on the people who carry out the policies and who have to generate enough energy and compassion and generosity. I've got to put a great deal of emphasis upon that, to put yourselves out for people and say, I'm going to do more than what the law says, more than what the recommendation says. Otherwise, the Royal Commissions are just provide another document.
Thank you. James has asked whether you could elaborate on your earlier point that Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil has now become the evil of banality.
Okay. Well, what she said, first of all, was that to identify cruelty by looking for psychopaths, for what we used to know as moral imbeciles, people who didn't have a conscience, was to run up a false path. The banality meant that the cruelty was built into a culture. So somebody like the mass murderer Adolf Eichmann was a product of a particular culture. To put it the other way around, what I mean by the evil of banality is that too many cruelties and abuses are just taken for granted, because too many people think that the major issue at the weekend is whether there's going to be a special on pork chops at Coles or Woolworths. So that the banality means, unfortunately, a sort of taken for granted, a sort of, particularly the response that there's nothing I can do about it. So when I talk about humanitarianism, the first thing you have to get over is the fatalism that people feel they can't do anything.
Thank you. Teresa has asked, do you think that there is a key value or ethic that's distorted to justify cruelty? And is cruelty ever used to shelter cowardice?
Well, yeah, there's certainly, it's a good question. I think cowardice runs through almost all the evidence of cruelty. It's the abusive use of power, frequently by bullies. I mean, the other side of that coin is to treat courage in public life as the sort of vaccine. It's a sort of penicillin that everybody needs. And courage, in my experience, is something you have to practice mentally and physically, particularly mental courage. I mean, to take a stand on something and not to be looking to curry favors, particularly from powerful figures, doesn't happen very often. I've watched the treatment of the Labour MP Shaukat Mosamain down here when most of his colleagues and most of the media did not stand up for him. So yes, cowardice, unfortunately, is more easily practiced than courage.
Tanya has asked whether you can comment on the recent student protests from a cruelty and humanity perspective. She says, how do you think these recent events will influence the younger generation's perception of their human rights and their capacity to evoke change through civil participation and protest?
Well, it's a great question. It's a good job we've got another 3 hours, Emma Kate, to answer. Look, you have to protest. You have to be outraged about injustice. Because if you want to establish who you are, what you stand for, what you're going to get out of life, how do you contribute to your friends, to the people you love and care for, you have to answer those questions. I spent some time in conversation with a wonderful Frenchman who died at the age of 93 or 95. But when he was 91, he wrote a book called, in English, Be Outraged. And he said he was one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he said there were 3 in his long life, and he was Jewish. He was a Jewish diplomat in France. He said there were 3 things that made him outraged. The first was the stupid way in which we had been deferential to free market economics, the idea that everybody was a commodity and you should spend your time competing. The second thing that outraged him was the absurd way, the brutal way in which we had treated planet Earth, as though all the resources of trees and fish and rivers and so on would go on forever. But then the third thing he said was that he was mostly outraged by the way the Israelis had treated the Palestinians. And he finished by saying, in particular to young people, if you are not outraged by injustice, you will lose touch with your own humanity. So that's my brief answer. I wonder if it was brief enough.
No, it was great. Thank you. So we've got a last question from Isabella before we wrap up for this evening. Thank you both so much again. This has been a wonderful discussion. Isabella asks, how do we go beyond raising awareness and affecting action specifically for the younger generation?
Well, I think you have, first of all, you can't do anything by yourself. I mean, I get given a lot of credit for doing certain things, but I've always work with other people, because the chemistry of being with friends, of generating the ideas, of having a plan. When we defended years ago the retention of universal health insurance in Australia, and after all, it remains one of the basis of a civil society, then that was only done by working on coalitions. I suppose if I have a particular prescription for in answer to Isabella's question, it's about the principle of altruism over egoism. I mean, I was taught that in the crafting of social and economic policies, the key issue was about the dominance of altruism over egoism. Not how can the individual accumulate as much as possible, but rather how can we build a sense of the common good, the shared endeavor, the public wealth, because most of the wealth that we benefit from is not about the size of our bank accounts, if we have one, but about clean water, clean air, the proper administration of justice. I said I was going to be short, but I haven't been.
Stuart, thank you so much. And thank you, Judith, as well. This has been a phenomenal discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure to host tonight. Do either of you have any final comments that you would like to make before I take the audience off mute? That will allow you to take yourselves off mute, and then you can join me in thanking Judith and Stuart for tonight's discussion.
I think I should go back quickly to Judith, because I've monopolized the past 10 minutes.
Oh, look, I just want to firstly thank Avid Reader for your exemplary books program and for having the courage to put on an event like this. Thanks to everybody who has watched and for your very intelligent questions. But above all, thank you to Stuart for never giving up in the fight for justice and also for giving us both poetry and hope. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the last question to Emma Kate is, how do you ensure that this book, and here I'm going to be completely egocentric, becomes a bestseller?
Well, everybody who's attended tonight can certainly help with that. So I've posted the link a couple of times in the chat box. I just shared it again. So open up and you can find it there. And don't forget that you can use that code EVENT, EVENT, on our website so that you can get 10% off, which is a promotion that we've got on at the moment for everybody in attendance. Thank you all so much once again. I'm going to allow you to take yourselves off mute now so that you can join me in thanking Judith and Stuart. So most of you should be off mute now. Thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pops.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very cute.